Welcome to my video. We're taking a look at one of the readings for the week. This one is entitled Chapter 4, Your Best Friend or Your Worst Enemy, The Significance of the Youth, Popular Culture, and Education. It is written by Jeffrey Duncan Andrade, who is this guy over here. And essentially what he's doing is looking at how to integrate pop culture, film, music, graphic novels, lyrics, even memes, stuff like that, into education, into the classroom. So essentially what he's looking at here, or his main points are that youth popular culture, it's not simply a process of consumption, but is a process of production and individual and collective interpretation. So when youth are consuming media, it's not simply that they're just listening to music, they are actually interpreting it, even if that is somewhat subconsciously. And in fact, you could argue with remix culture that there's actually a lot more interpretation than has been in the past. So because of that sort of stuff, educators should then be using that popular culture text in our classrooms, not necessarily to replace the current text, but as additives. Having said that, it is in the jam-packed classrooms that we have, the odds are something is going to have to leave. So there are different pedagogies, different ways of looking at how to integrate popular culture in education. The first of them would be hierarchical practice. So in this system, the teacher has all the answers and the student doesn't. So the students need to listen to what the teacher says so that they can have that knowledge as well. So there are some positives to this. One is if you're trying to pass a standardized test, the teacher literally does have the answers and the student then should be listening. So that's really the only positive. I guess classroom control can also be good there. You can make sure your classroom is quiet. Negative, however, there's no critical thinking going on. Students are not owning their education at all. It essentially functions actually a bit like cultural imperialism, where the school board and the teacher are determining what is important and what counts as culture, and the student just needs to check off the boxes and learn what that means. They don't, of course. The only checking that the students do is when they check out. In dialogic practice, which would be the next one, this is sort of an attempt to ensure that voiceless, the kids who aren't participating in a hierarchical practice, do have a voice. They're allowed to participate. So in this one, the teacher would be talking, the teachers engage the students in discussions of those class texts, and they can hear their voices and see what they think. So there's some positives. It allows the students to participate, which is good. Some negatives, it's still cultural imperialism. It's still the teacher or the school board determining what counts as culture and what doesn't, and the students are simply invited to participate in a culture which they may or may not feel any link to. Students are only invited to personalize those meanings in those texts. It also doesn't take into account that voiceless, those students who aren't participating in the previous model, that they haven't really found any other space for culture, when in actuality they may very well have. The next one would be practical pedagogy. So in this one, students work for their own understanding with their own texts. So there is some good for this. We're giving them the tools to examine their own texts. Here's our teacher, and here are our students learning with their own text. Now this does legitimize an alternate text. It recognizes that there could be other culture, which is good. There are some negatives. It does underestimate the cultural deconstruction that might already be happening. And it also underestimates the fact that the tools, the deconstructive tools that students may already have, that the teacher is unaware of because of the nature of the genre of whatever you're studying, that's not taken into account as having any value. So this sort of replicates the hierarchical pedagogy as far as the teacher has all the deconstructive tools. So the recommendation of the article is that it's to work with students to construct meaning for their own popular texts as critical civic participants, and then the instructor functions as a guide, as this guy is doing. So you're listening to the students as much as you are talking. So you're going to provide some deconstructive tools, but you're still going to be listening to what they have to say, and it's more of a collaborative activity rather than a teacher having the answers. So now, why is it that we would want to bring popular media texts into our classrooms anyways? So one of them is most students are aware of them because popular media is just everywhere and it's really hard to get away from it, especially this guy. Most students have at least a passing knowledge of all these media texts. Now this is in stark contrast to texts from artists such as Shakespeare, who's barely known by students from Western culture or our Western cultural heritage, and let alone people who are immigrants or have from a different ethnic background. So allowing to use popular media, then you have an immediate sense of familiarity right off the bat. One of the most important elements of education that we really want our students to be able to do is this idea about thinking critically. Now, we can do this sort of stuff with Romeo and Juliet, but we can do it just as well with popular texts. In fact, well, isn't that actually what we would want? In this way, you would critically examine specific texts of their own culture. So without assistance, without some time set aside for this deconstruction, students would spend hours intellectually disengaged as they consume all this media. By offering a space for this critical thinking of these texts, we could change that. And then that way they'd be able to interact with their own media texts using tools that they have and tools that we have. And that time is where they're able to think their way through these things. And then the hope is carry that outside of the classroom as well. It could increase engagement in the classroom. Now this is, of course, is going to determine on the nature of the engagement. Now, if students are allowed to work on text they are invested in emotionally or they just like it, they might be more engaged in the learning. Like, she is very engaged, and this guy over there, very engaged as well. And this could help. It depends on the nature of it. If it's treated with respect, then I think it would. There are some real-world connections. Popular texts are popular and they tend to be recent. So by examining those texts, the issues and themes that those are about can also be brought into the classroom. So some of these issues like media studies and so forth, this is often the best way to engage with students on these issues. If it appears that time has been set aside, such as now it's time to talk about blank, there tends to be a lot of eye rolling and they're not as interested and they just tune out because it's time for teacher to preach. It also allows us to get to know our students a lot. Youth culture and youth are different than we are. In fact, as I get older, I find that that gap is getting bigger. By learning about text with the students, we learn about them and their culture a little bit more, and they learn about you a little bit more. In a similar vein, it also acknowledges our own bias. Not necessarily our own bias, but I mean there would be, but also our culture's bias and our school board's bias and the Western culture's bias on what is determined to be this is what culture means, or this is a classics of literature. Whereas there are of course other literatures which are also great, however they're not necessarily studied. So by bringing in some of these other texts, we're acknowledging that there could be other texts which are also good. It also creates this natural space for this media studies. In my secondary school world, we need to be teaching media studies in every English class. And however, it's often not done, or the study of media is when you watch the DiCaprio version of Romeo and Juliet at the end of the unit. I'm assuming something similar happens in elementary. So by incorporating these popular media texts into the classroom, this way it just comes in naturally. There's a lot of opportunities. It also lessens the cultural divide. So the way students see the world is there's the world over here's the teacher world and the school world, and then over here we have the student world. And they think we cannot possibly understand the complexities of their lives, and we kind of think that they have no clue what's going on. So what this can do is lessen that cultural divide, where they'll recognize by studying and treating their media text with respect that they are more likely to be able to see, oh, okay, this cultural divide can be lessened. So now what? What are some recommendations that the article is trying to say? Well, the first one would be to do it. There actually don't seem to be a lot of negatives. The positives definitely outweigh it. Now, this is not to say, and the article is not trying to say we need to replace Romeo and Juliet, with Romeo Must Die, or we got to replace Elizabeth Barrett Browning with, Taylor Swift. But students could look at movies as narratives, and you could look as lyrics in a poetry unit. So this is not to replace everything, but you could add. There are still some things that texts should know, or students should know. Some texts are just so good they are worthy of study, and they could be by Shakespeare. But sometimes we sort of get locked into these things and we refuse to accept that anything good could have been written since the 17th century. Now, obviously this is untrue and is actually somewhat inconsequential. Whether we want to use a popular text or not should be determined by the purpose of the lesson. If the purpose of the lesson is to learn how to critically examine a text, why wouldn't you have students examine a popular text? It could offer more insights into their world, into the nature of, I guess, humanity itself. Thanks for listening. That's our video, the first video anyways. Check out the discussion, and we'll see you over there on Blackboard.